6 months after Judge Blackwood's arrest, Sarah Richardson stood before a different kind of crowd. The former private prison, its contracts canceled, and its corruption exposed, had been transformed. Today, its heavy gates would open as the Millbrook Center for Civil Rights and Legal Education, the state's first tuition-free law school. When they tried to bury us, Sarah addressed the assembled students, many former youth center graduates among them. They didn't know we were seats. The crowd erupted in applause, but her eyes found Maya in the front row, now wearing a Yale Law Teaching Fellows badge alongside her student ID. The investigation had revealed a network of corrupt judges across 3 states, all connected to Capital Development Corporation's prison expansion scheme. Detective Morrison's cooperation, sparked by a midnight visit from federal agents to his offshore account, had blown the case wide open. Now he watched the ceremony from a prison cell, his testimony ensuring he'd have plenty of company. James stepped to the podium, his mayoral approval ratings soaring after his role in exposing the corruption. Today, we don't just celebrate justice served, he began, his hand finding Sarah's. We celebrate justice transformed. Every classroom in this building represents a cell that won't cage another innocent life. Every graduate will carry forward our commitment that no one is above the law. Alina Rodriguez, recently awarded a Pulitzer for her investigation, caught Maya's eye from the press section and nodded toward the back of the crowd. Judge Blackwood's wife sat there, tears streaming down her face. After her husband's fatal heart attack, she turned state's evidence, exposing decades of judicial corruption. Her testimony had freed over 300 wrongfully convicted individuals so far. But our work isn't finished, Sarah continued, her voice carrying across the converted prison yard. Yesterday, I received a letter from a judge in Georgia facing similar corruption. Her court-appointed defender program is being dismantled by private interests. Today, we sent our first legal aid team to help. The crowd cheered as Maya stood with 5 other young lawyers, all wearing shirts bearing the youth center's motto. The truth comes to light. They would leave tomorrow, carrying the lessons of Millbrook to other battlegrounds. Some said we went too far. James addressed the skeptics. That exposing judicial corruption would shake people's faith in the system. But sunlight doesn't destroy what's righteous. It reveals what needs to change. As if on cue, the sun broke through the clouds, illuminating the building's new sign. Below it, a smaller plaque bore the names of every person wrongfully convicted in Blackwood's court. Their stories would be talkier, ensuring future lawyers understood the human cost of corruption. Mom, Maya whispered as the ceremony ended, remember what you told me the night they arrested you? About the truth always coming to light. Sarah hugged her daughter, watching students explore their new campus, formerly condemned men and women now preparing to become defenders of justice. Sometimes the light needs a little help, she smiled. Later that evening, the Richardson family gathered in their living room, the same room where their ordeal began. Maya's Yale acceptance letter, now framed alongside newspaper headlines about Blackwood's exposure, held a place of honor. The governor called, James announced, they want to expand our program statewide. 10 more corrupt judges identified through Morrison's testimony. Sarah squeezed his hand, remembering Blackwood's final warning about they. You've been right. There were more powerful forces at work, but he'd been wrong about them winning. Then we keep going, she said, watching Elena's latest exposa light up their phones. Every court, every town, every judge who thinks they're above justice. Like you always say at the center, Mom, Maya grinned, holding up her case files for tomorrow's journey. The truth comes to light. No, Sarah corrected, looking at her family. Mayor, journalist, lawyer, and activist, united in purpose. We bring it to light. That's the difference. Outside, the converted prison's lights illuminated the darkness, a beacon of change visible for miles. Inside its walls, a new generation of defenders prepared to carry forward the lesson of Millbrook. Justice isn't just served, it's fought for, protected, and transformed by those brave enough to stand for truth. The courtroom fell silent as Sarah Richardson rose for sentencing. Through the tall windows, she could see the sea of supporters holding vigil outside, their letters for Sarah signs catching the morning light. Inside, every bench was packed. Former students, community leaders, and parents whose children had found their way through her youth center doors. Judge Blackwood's face betrayed no emotion as he adjusted his robes, but his fingers drummed an impatient rhythm on his desk. The previous day's protest had delayed proceedings by hours, and the mayor's unexpected participation had clearly rattled him. Before sentencing, Marcus Webb stood, his voice steady now. The defense moves to enter new evidence regarding financial transactions between Capital Development Corporation and denied. Blackwood's gavel crashed down. This court has already ruled on the admissibility of your spurious conspiracy theories, counselor. One more word and you'll be held in contempt. Sarah watched Marcus's jaw clench, but he held his ground. She caught Elena Rodriguez scribbling furiously in the press section, while Mina sat beside her father, both their faces masks of contained fury. Mrs. Richardson, Blackwood's voice dripped with false concern. Do you have anything to say before this court passes sentence? Sarah stood, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. She prepared a statement, a careful plea for mercy, but looking at Blackwood's smug expression, she chose a different path. I've spent 20 years teaching our children that the truth matters, she began, her voice carrying to every corner. That justice is blind. That the system, despite its flaws, works for everyone. She paused, meeting Blackwood's gaze directly. I wonder, Your Honor, what will you tell your grandchildren when they ask about this day? Color rose in Blackwood's cheeks. This court will not be lectured by a criminal. My youth center has sent 417 children to college, Sarah continued, her voice rising, while your private prison investments have sent thousands of our children to jail. The real crime. Silence. Blackwood thundered, but Sarah pressed on. The real crime is a system that sees black success as a threat. That takes bribes from corporations to condemn innocent people. That uses this courtroom to. Mrs. Richardson. Blackwood's face was purple now. One more word and I'll add contempt to your sentence, which, given the severity of your crimes against this community's youth, will be substantial. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Maya gripped her father's arm as Blackwood shuffled his papers with trembling hands. Sarah Richardson, this court finds your attempts to poison our community's youth particularly abhorrent. Your use of a so-called youth center to mask your criminal enterprise shows a level of moral corruption that demands the strongest possible response. He paused for effect, clearly savoring the moment. I hereby sentence you to life imprisonment, with the possibility of parole after 50 years. The courtroom exploded. Marcus shouted objections while supporters screamed in protest. But it was Detective Morrison's quiet laugh from the prosecution table that cut through the chaos, until Mayor Richardson stood. Your Honor, James's voice carried the weight of his office. I move to address this court regarding a matter of urgent public concern. Denied. Blackwood spat. Bailiff, clear the courtroom. As officers moved to control the crowd, Sarah caught her husband's eye. In that moment, she saw his decision. The same one she'd made during her speech. Some truths couldn't be hidden anymore, no matter the cost. Then I address you not as mayor, James announced, his voice rising above the din, but as Sarah Richardson's husband of 15 years. The courtroom froze. Judge Blackwood's gavel slipped from suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering against his desk like a death knell for his carefully constructed charade. And I have evidence, James continued into the shocked silence, that will expose every corrupt deal, every rigged case, and every dollar Your Honor has received from Capital Development Corporation. Detective Morrison was already reaching for his phone, but Elena Rodriguez stood, holding up her press credentials. Too late, Detective. The story just went live. National news in 5 minutes. The Millbrook County Courthouse loomed like a monument to broken dreams, its marble columns casting long shadows across the morning crowd. Inside Courtroom 3, Sarah Richardson watched as Judge Blackwood systematically dismantled any chance of a fair trial. Her court-appointed attorney, Marcus Webb, fresh out of law school with student debt hanging over his head, seemed to shrink with each passing moment. "Your Honor," Marcus stammered, "I object to the dismissal of juror number 8. Her work at a different youth center doesn't automatically indicate bias." Objection overruled. Blackwood's gavel crack echoed like a gunshot. Mrs. Johnson's similar work environment could prejudice her perception. Next juror. Sarah counted silently. 7 black jurors dismissed, each for increasingly absurd reasons. One for having a cousin who'd once attended her youth center. Another for living in the wrong neighborhood. A third for looking confrontational while answering basic questions. In the gallery, Maya sat between Elena and her father, frantically taking notes. James Richardson maintained his mayoral poker face, though his knuckles were white where they gripped his armrest. The evidence they gathered from the hotel meeting remained frustratingly inadmissible. Morrison's timely traffic stop had given him the chance to confiscate their phones as potential drug evidence. "Your Honor," Marcus tried again. "The defense moves for a mistrial based on clear pattern of racial." "Careful, counselor." Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Consider your next words very carefully. Contempt of court is a serious charge for a young attorney just starting his career." Sora watched Marcus deflate, seeing the same fear she'd witnessed in countless young faces at her center. She glanced at the jury box, now filled with faces that looked nothing like her community. The fix was in just as Morrison had promised during her arrest. Blackwood's courtroom, Blackwood's rules. During a recess, she found Marcus hunched over the defense table, hands shaking. "They paid off my loans," he whispered, not meeting her eyes. "Last week. $300,000, just gone. Said it was a clerical error if I asked questions." He finally looked up, tears in his eyes. "I can't. My family." Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder, understanding the weight of systemic pressure all too well. "Then don't fight for me. Fight for what's right. That's all any of us can do." Back in session, Detective Morrison took the stand, his testimony a masterclass in calculated lies. He painted Sarah as a sophisticated drug kingpin, using the youth center as a front. Each lie built on the next, creating a castle of corruption that felt impenetrable. But then Marcus stood, something new in his stance. "Detective Morrison," his voice was steadier now, "could you explain why Capital Development Corporation deposited $50,000 into your offshore account 2 days before the raid on Mrs. Richardson's home?" The courtroom erupted. Morrison's face went pale. Blackwood's gavel thundered. "Counselor, approach the bench immediately." Maya grabbed Elena's arm. "That's from our photos. How did he?" Elena smiled, showing her phone under her notebook. "Let's just say your father's not the only one with friends in the banking industry. Sometimes justice needs a helping hand." But their victory was short-lived. Blackwood's voice cut through the chaos. "This line of questioning is excluded. Furthermore, the jury will disregard any implications of impropriety. Detective Morrison's financial records are not relevant to this case." Sarah watched her last hope of a fair trial crumble as Blackwood systematically blocked every attempt to expose the truth. But something had shifted. Marcus stood taller now, his fear transformed into quiet determination. In the gallery, Maya was already typing furiously on a borrowed laptop, her Yale-bound mind clearly formulating her next move. "The prosecution calls its next witness," Blackwood announced, "Mr. James Wallace, CEO of Capital Development Corporation." Sarah felt her husband tense behind her. The real puppet master was about to take the stage, and with him, perhaps their last chance to expose the whole corrupt system. Judge William Blackwood's chambers were a shrine to what he called traditional values. Behind his mahogany desk, positioned so visitors couldn't miss it, hung a carefully framed Confederate flag, a family heirloom, he'd explained with practiced casualness. The walls displayed his hunting trophies and law degree from Ole Miss, class of '82. But it was the small collection of newspaper clippings that truly revealed the man's character. Headlines celebrating his tough-on-crime sentences, each one marking another black life consumed by the system. The Richardson case, he muttered, savoring the name like aged bourbon as he reviewed the file. His clerk, Thomas, shifted uncomfortably by the door. In 15 years working for Blackwood, he learned to read the judge's moods, and this one spelled trouble. Sir, there might be a conflict of interest, Thomas ventured, given the proximity to Mayor Richardson's. Mayor Richardson. Blackwood's laugh was sharp and hollow. That affirmative action experiment won't last past the next election. Besides, this is different. Sarah Richardson, running that youth center. His lips curled around the words. Finally caught peddling drugs to children. Shameful. Thomas thought about mentioning the youth center's stellar record, how it had sent more kids to college than any program in the state. But he remembered what happened to the last clerk who questioned the judge's perspectives. Instead, he watched Blackwood circle the arraignment date in red ink. Across town, in the modest office of the mayor, James Richardson gripped his desk until his knuckles went white. The late-night call from the detention center played on repeat in his mind. Sarah's voice, strong despite everything, laying out their options. They planted those drugs, James. Morrison practically admitted it after the cameras left. This goes deeper than just another racist judge. I can make a statement, he had offered. Use the mayor's office toe. No. Sarah's voice had been firm. You expose our marriage now, they'll say you corrupted the investigation. We need to let them show their hand. Show everyone what's really happening in Millbrook's justice system. Now, staring at his wife's booking photo on his desk, James wondered if they were gambling with too high stakes. His phone buzzed. A text from Elena Rodriguez at the Tribune. Capital Development Corporation just filed permits for the youth center lot. They're moving fast. The pieces were falling into place, painting an ugly picture. But before he could reply, his assistant burst in. Sir, Judge Blackwood just specially requested Sarah Richardson's case. James felt his stomach drop. Blackwood. The same judge who had sentenced a young black mother to 20 years for defending herself against an abusive ex. The judge who quoted Bible verses while sending black teenagers to adult prisons. The judge who played golf every Sunday with the private prison executives. He can't, James whispered, then louder. He can't. There has to be another judge available. He insisted, said something about making an example. James closed his eyes, Sarah's words echoing in his mind. Let them show their hand. Opening his eyes, he reached for his phone and dialed Elena's number. Remember that story I wouldn't comment on last month? About Blackwood's connection to capital development? His voice was steady despite the storm in his chest. I think it's time to dig deeper. As he hung up, his assistant handed him the morning's press schedule. Top of the list, a ribbon-cutting ceremony with Judge Blackwood for the new private prison wing. Jane stared at the itinerary, wondering how many more families would be torn apart before this was over. Cancel everything, he said quietly, and get me Sarah's public defender on the phone. I need to know exactly what we're up against. Sarah Richardson stood in her living room, surrounded by the joyful chaos of her daughter Maya's celebration. Yale acceptance letters didn't come often to families in Millbrook, and certainly not with full scholarships. The room buzzed with the excited chatter of Maya's closest friends and a few youth center volunteers who had become like family over the years. Mom, they even want me for their pre-law program. Maya's eyes sparkled as she read the letter for perhaps the 100th time. Sarah watched her daughter, feeling a familiar ache of pride mixed with caution. The same feeling that had led her to build the youth center in the first place. A safe haven where black children could dream without limits, even in a town like Millbrook. The sharp crack of splintering wood drowned out Maya's voice. The front door burst open, flooding the room with armored figures and shouted commands. Sarah's first instinct was to shield Maya, but rough hands yanked them apart. Through the chaos, she glimpsed the letters DEA emblazoned on tactical vests. Everyone on the ground. This is a drug raid. The command echoed through her pristine living room as guests were forced to their knees. Sarah's mind raced. There had to be a mistake. In 20 years of running the youth center, she hadn't so much as allowed cigarettes on the property. Well, what do we have here? A detective's voice dripped with artificial surprise as he approached Maya's celebration table. Sarah watched in horror as he lifted Maya's Yale acceptance letter, shaking it slightly. A small plastic bag filled with white powder fluttered to the floor. "That's not mine." Maya's voice cracked with panic. "Mom, that's not mine." Sarah struggled against the officer restraining her. "This is ridiculous. I'm Sarah Richardson. I run the Millbrook Youth Center. My husband." She caught herself just in time. James had always insisted they keep their marriage private to protect her work from political backlash. Now, watching drugs being discovered throughout her home, she understood his paranoia wasn't unfounded. The youth center. The detective's smile widened. "Interesting. We've had anonymous tips about that place for months. Guess you were using those kids as cover, huh?" Sarah's blood ran cold as she recognized him. Detective Morrison had been at the youth center last week with representatives from Capital Development Corporation. They'd offered to buy the property for 3 times its value, promising to revitalize the neighborhood. She'd shown them the door. "You can't do this," Sarah managed, watching officers tear through the house she'd spent 15 years making into a home. "We have rights." "Rights?" Morrison laughed, holding up a search warrant. "Judge Blackwood signed this himself. He's very interested in cleaning up our city's problem areas." The name sent chills down Sarah's spine. Everyone in Millbrook knew about Judge William Blackwood and his particular brand of justice. The same judge who'd sentenced a black honor student to 10 years for possession, while letting a wealthy white teenager walk free on the same charge. As handcuffs closed around her wrists, Sarah caught a final glimpse of Maya being held back by her friends, tears streaming down her face. The Yale acceptance letter lay trampled on the floor, dreams scattered like the carefully arranged celebration snacks now ground into the carpet. "Maya, call Ms. Rodriguez of the Tribune." Sarah managed before being dragged toward the door. "And baby, remember what we always say at the center. The truth comes to light," Maya finished, her voice stronger now despite the tears. "No matter what." Sarah nodded, holding on to that thought as she was led to the waiting police car. Through the window, she could see neighbors gathering, phones recording. Above them all, the campaign billboard she helped design last year seemed to mock her current situation. James Richardson for mayor. Justice for all. The evening news flickered across thousands of Millbrook homes. Shaky cell phone footage of Sarah Richardson being led into court, followed by shots of Judge Blackwood dismissing yet another black juror. But it was the next clip that set social media ablaze. Principal Johnson from Millbrook High, tears streaming down her face, holding up her daughter's college acceptance letter. "Sarah Richardson got my baby into Harvard," she declared to the cameras. "When everyone else said my girl was too rough, too loud, Sarah saw her potential. Now they want us to believe she's some drug dealer. Look at the truth." Behind her, a sea of former youth center students raised their own college acceptance letters like shields against injustice. The hashtag Letters for Sarah began trending within hours. Inside his office, Mayor James Richardson watched the coverage while fielding calls from increasingly concerned city council members. A protest crowd had swelled to over 3,000 outside the courthouse, their chants echoing through downtown. "No justice, no peace." "Sir," his assistant interrupted, "Reverend Matthews is here with the community leaders." James straightened his tie, pushing down the urge to tell them everything. About his marriage, about the corruption, about the private prison conspiracy. Instead, he maintained his careful political neutrality as the delegation filed in. "Mr. Mayor," Reverend Matthews began, "this has gone too far. Judge Blackwood just issued arrest warrants for peaceful protesters claiming they're disrupting court proceedings. They're targeting our youth organizers first." "My hands are tied legally," James began, the practiced words tasting like ash. "The judiciary is a separate." "Your hands are tied." Ms. Parker, the elderly neighborhood watch captain, stepped forward. "My grandson is in Sarah's after-school program. Last month, he was ready to join a gang. Now he's talking about college. And you're telling me your hands are tied." Before James could respond, his phone buzzed. A text from Maya. Dad, Elena found something big. Capital Development's offshore accounts. They're paying consulting fees to shell companies owned by Judge Blackwood's wife. The mayor's eyes snapped to his computer as Elena's email arrived containing documents from the Cayman Islands. Each transaction was a breadcrumb leading straight to Blackwood's chambers. But using this evidence meant revealing how they obtained it and potentially destroying any chance of it being admissible in court. A commotion outside drew everyone to the windows. Police in riot gear were forming lines around the protesters. Officer Morrison stood at the front, megaphone in hand, looking far too eager to escalate. They're going to start arresting people, Reverend Matthews said quietly. Our children. James Richardson felt the weight of his golden mayoral chain, a symbol of progress that now felt like a shackle. His phone buzzed again. Sarah, calling from jail. They're hurting our kids, she said without preamble. James, we have to do something. Through the window, he watched as Maya joined the front line of protesters, linking arms with her youth center friends. She held her Yale acceptance letter high, a beacon in the growing darkness. The moment crystallized. Sometimes justice needed more than careful political maneuvering. Sometimes it needed a spark. James reached for his coat. Where are you going, Mr. Mayor? His assistant called after him. To join my daughter, he answered, his voice carrying the authority of both mayor and father, and to stand with my people. As he strode out of City Hall, Reverend Matthews and the other leaders fell in behind him. News cameras swiveled to capture the mayor of Millbrook walking purposefully toward the protest line. Detective Morrison's face contorted with confusion as James approached. The mayor's voice carried across the square. Officer Morrison, I believe you're about to violate the constitutional rights of these peaceful protesters, and I have some very interesting banking records that suggest you might want to reconsider. The crowd erupted in cheers as Morrison lowered his megaphone. But James knew this was just the beginning. The real battle would come tomorrow in Blackwood's courtroom, and this time he was done playing by the corrupt judge's rules. The next hour transformed Millbrook forever. As Elena's expose hit the national news feeds, Judge Blackwood's carefully constructed world imploded in real time. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, their cameras capturing every trembling word as James Richardson laid bare 15 years of corruption. My wife and I kept our marriage private. The mayor's voice rang out, not out of shame, but because we knew this day would come. We knew that certain powers in this city couldn't tolerate a successful black woman showing our children a different path. Inside the courtroom, now broadcast live on every major network. Sarah stood tall beside her husband while Maya distributed flash drives to reporters. Copies of every transaction, every secret meeting, every corrupt deal. Judge Blackwood's private prison investments total over $12 million, Elena explained to the cameras. Each case he presided over that sent someone to these facilities earned him a commission, but the youth center property was special. Capital Development Corporation promised him a seat on their board with stock options worth $50 million. The evidence was damning. Surveillance photos showed Blackwood meeting with prison executives. Bank records revealed payments laundered through his wife's consulting firm. But it was the audio recording Maya played next that silenced every doubt. The Richardson woman is a problem, Blackwood's voice crackled through the speakers. Her youth center success stories make it harder to justify our expansion. Morrison will handle the evidence, I'll handle the trial. By next month, that property is ours, and those kids can learn about the justice system from the inside. The judge's face, already pale, turned ashen. His hand moved toward his chest as reporters shouted questions. Detective Morrison tried to slip out a side door, but found federal agents waiting. Your Honor, Marcus Webb stood, his voice steady with newfound confidence. The defense moves for an immediate mistrial and dismissal of all charges based on judicial misconduct. Before Blackwood could respond, the courthouse doors burst open. FBI agents strode in, led by a stern-faced woman in a dark suit. William Blackwood, she announced, you're under federal investigation for racketeering, corruption, and civil rights violations. Please step down from the bench. The courtroom erupted in chaos. But through it all, Sarah watched her former students in the gallery, seeing hope replace fear in their eyes. This was her real victory, showing them that truth could still triumph over power. "Mom," Maya whispered, gripping her hand. "Look." On every phone screen, social media exploded with hashtag Millbrook Justice videos. Former defendants from Blackwood's court shared their stories. Prison reform advocates demanded investigations nationwide. But most powerful were the youth center success stories. Doctors, lawyers, teachers, all standing up to say, "Sarah Richardson saved my life." James wrapped his arms around his family, no longer hiding their bond. "I'm sorry it took so long," he murmured. "No," Sarah smiled, watching Blackwood being led away in handcuffs, his precious Confederate flag falling from the wall behind him. The timing was perfect. Sometimes justice needs witnesses. Elena approached with her phone out. "Mayor Richardson, Mrs. Richardson, the governor's office is calling. They're announcing an immediate review of every case Judge Blackwood ever presided over." Outside, the crowd's chants changed from protest to celebration. But Maya's voice cut through their moment of triumph. "Dad, Mom, something's wrong." They turned to see Judge Blackwood slumped over his bench, clutching his chest. His face contorted with pain, but his eyes locked onto Sarah's with pure hatred. As paramedics rushed in, he managed to spit out 7 words that would haunt them. "This isn't over. They'll never let you win." Sarah watched them wheel him out, wondering what he meant by they and why Detective Morrison was smiling despite his handcuffs. Something told her this victory, sweet as it was, had only revealed the tip of a much darker iceberg. Maya Richardson sat in her car outside the Millbrook Tribune, clutching the Yale deferral letter she'd sent that morning. The prestigious law school could wait. Justice couldn't. She watched Elena Rodriguez through the newsroom window, the veteran reporter's face illuminated by her computer screen in the growing dusk. Maya's hand tightened around the USB drive in her pocket, containing everything she'd managed to dig up on Judge Blackwood so far. "You look just like your mother," Elena said minutes later, studying Maya across her cluttered desk. She had that same look in her eyes when she caught the previous mayor stealing funds from the school district. "You knew my mother before." "Honey, Sarah Richardson was my best source for 15 years. Elena's voice softened. "And my biggest regret. 3 months ago, she brought me evidence about Judge Blackwood and capital development. I was too scared to run it." She pulled out a thick file. "Maybe it's time to fix that mistake." Maya spread out her own research on the desk. Property records, court documents, and a spreadsheet tracking every black business owner prosecuted in Blackwood's court. The pattern was impossible to miss. Each prosecution followed a refused buyout offer from Capital Development. "Look at this," Elena pointed to a document. "Every property they acquired ends up rezoned for correctional facilities support services. They're building an empire around that new private prison, and your mother's youth center sits right in the middle of their planned expansion." Maya's phone buzzed. A text from her father. "Beat care fuel." They're watching. She looked up to see Elena already closing the blinds. "We need proof of the connection," Elena muttered, typing rapidly. "Something concrete linking Blackwood to Capital Development and the private prison company." "What are their board meetings?" Maya asked, pulling out her laptop. "Every corporation has to have shareholders' meetings." Elena's eyes lit up. "They're having one tomorrow night at the Grand Hotel, but it's completely locked down. Invitation only, armed security." Maya's fingers flew across her keyboard. "The hotel's booking system runs on an ancient database. Same one we hacked in Computer Club for practice." She looked up, a hint of her mother's determination in her eyes. "How do you feel about being a catering server?" Hours later, Maya adjusted her borrowed server's uniform in the hotel kitchen while Lena loaded appetizers onto a tray. They gained access through the back entrance, mixed in with the actual catering staff during the pre-meeting rush. "Remember," Elena whispered, "we just need photos of the attendance list and any documents they leave out. No heroes." She froze. Through the kitchen door's window, they saw Detective Morrison, escorting Judge Blackwood into the conference room. Change of plans, Maya said, pulling out her phone. We follow them. The next hour was a masterclass in stealth. Maya and Elena moved through the room offering hors d'oeuvres while discreetly photographing documents left on tables. But it was what they overheard that made their blood run cold. The Richardson conviction is guaranteed, Blackwood was saying to a group of suits. Once that youth center property is condemned, the whole block is yours. We'll have enough cells to double the current contracts. And the mayor? Someone asked. He won't risk his career defending a drug dealer. Even if Blackwood stopped staring at Maya. Their eyes met for a long moment before recognition dawned on his face. Maya ran, but not before hearing Blackwood bark into his phone. Get me Morrison. Now. In Elena's car, racing through the night, they reviewed their evidence. Photos of contracts, development plans, and most damning, a list of targeted acquisitions with the youth center at the top, followed by dates matching each fraudulent prosecution. This is it, Elena said, her voice shaking. This is what your mother was. Red and blue lights filled the rearview mirror. Morrison's cruiser was gaining on them, and Maya's phone was already ringing, her father's number. Dad, she answered, we got proof, but we need help. Now.